Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. In the previous video, we went through the afterword written by the editor Noerr, and we basically explained the philosophical context and background in which the book was written, the philosophical ideas that were, the starting point of the book. So we talked about state capitalism, we talked about Horkheimer's theory of racket, which were, the ideas on which they based the Dialectic of Enlightenment. So now we are going to start reading from the main work, and the first thing that we are going to read is the prefaces. Now there are 3 prefaces, and the book starts with the newest one, the newest preface, and gradually works back towards the oldest. And so it starts with the preface of 1969, then you have the Italian preface of 1966, then you have the original preface, the 1947/1944 preface, which is the preface of the original publication of the book. Now, about the history of the book and the dates mentioned, we already more or less explained what was up with that in the afterword. We explained what each date kind of signifies for the book, but it's always interesting to read the prefaces first. I always insist on this, like read the prefaces, read the introduction, read the commentaries, read everything that you have in the book. And what is important here is to read the prefaces with the knowledge of the book's history in mind. So we can start right away. So let's jump into the prefaces. Now you can read the prefaces in both the order put in the book or in the chronological order, meaning that you can start with either the 1969 preface, or you start with the 1944 and you move up towards the 1969 preface. But I suggest doing it with the order of the book. So we start with the 1969 preface. Now it starts with the statement that the book was first published in 1947, when we said that it was actually published in 1944. But as I said, these 2 dates, I mean, we will explain later what's up with those 2 dates. But what is interesting about the 1969 preface is, well, the authors give their reasons there for why they wanted to reprint, or why they accepted to reprint the book, which was out of print for some time back then. It's that they think that it's still relevant for the time that they were living in, meaning the 60s and the 70s. What is very interesting about this work is that it insists on always being linked to its historical context of either its original period, the 40s, or the period in which you want to relate it to its content. Like if you read this book today, it's either because you want to study the period in which the book was originally produced, so the 1940s, or because you want this book to answer specific contemporary issues. So the reason why they accepted to reprint it is because they believe that the social and political context corresponds to the content of the book. So Horkheimer and Adorno, well, first of all, they don't like universalism, to think that ideas, even philosophical ideas, can be applied to whatever period that you want. That's kind of what makes philosophy a caricature. Like, philosophy is supposed to capture the essence of its own time, and it has to be applied. I mean, if it has to be applied to another time, then it must be that period does have fundamental similarities with the time in which that philosophy emerged. So you cannot really use this book if you take philosophy as an activity for hermits that are disengaged with the world and who live in an ivory tower. You won't find any idea that it's not directly linked to the social context of the 40s, or you cannot apply this philosophy without even trying to relate to your own context, to find some sort of similarities between what they are saying and with the actual period in which you are living in. So if you try to apply this philosophy when the historical context has changed dramatically, you will probably miss the point of the book and actually end up using it on a superfluous and very surface level, you will turn it into a caricature rather than, grasp its deep philosophical insight, which I think is precisely what is happening to it whenever I see someone who relate many word events to this work. I think that would be irresponsible. It's an irresponsible way to use the book, and I would even consider it a little bit rude when you try to apply this the philosophy of this book without taking into consideration the importance of the historical context. I think that it would be rude when you consider this particular phrase by the authors. They said no one who was not involved in the writing of the book could easily understand to what extent we both feel responsible for every sentence. We dictated long stretches together. The dialectic derives its vital energy from the tension between the two intellectual temperaments which came together in writing it. Now, the reason they claim that they were responsible for every sentence is because they both worked on this book. They both worked, their asses off on this book, and so they feel responsible towards one another, given that they have two different intellectual temperaments, which we already covered in the afterword last week. But it's also because this work is, it is a huge responsibility, given what they try to do with it, given the thesis that they defend, the context in which they worked, etc. This is not a work to be taken lightly, and you have to know about the authors themselves, their philosophical journey, their transformation, etc. So the responsibility of the authors also asks for the responsibility of the readers regarding this book. So you cannot abstract it from its context, like that's basically your responsibility. You cannot abstract this book from its context, and you also have to keep in mind that Adorno and Horkheimer changed their views on many things that they said in this book. To quote again, "We do not stand by everything we said in the book in its original form. That would be incompatible with a theory which attributes a temporal core to truth instead of contrasting truth as something invariable to the movement of history. The book was written at a time when the end of National Socialism, the Nazis, terror was in sight." So this is a work that was produced as a response to the fascist regimes of the first half of the 20th century and must therefore be read as such. What gives the book truth, what gives its truth value, it's not that it transcends its historical context, but that it corresponds to it. And it's just that they see some features of the fascism that they criticized in this book in the 40s that are still alive in later periods, and so it's because of that that they accepted to reprint the book, and they actually changed a few things. So notably their analysis is about their worry that the transition to an administrative world follows inherent fascist tendencies, the same fascist tendencies that they saw in the 40s. They saw that many of them were still alive today in the post Second World War world. So when they reprinted the book, it was when the Third World was being taken over by totalitarian dictatorships after the countries were supposedly decolonized, and it was also during a period of social unrest in Europe and the US with the civil rights movement, the Cold War, the rise of consumerism as a manipulation tool. You also had totalitarian bureaucracies, etc. So all of these contribute to the real problem that they feared, which is they call this problem the development toward total integration. Like the book is basically a warning towards this sort of development, that everything becomes integral to a system, that no thought can be that no one can think outside of the system. So there is a process of making everything the same. Whatever presents itself like unique or novel is itself produced by a system that makes everything the same. Everything is being standardized, even philosophy. And so this is the goal of totalitarianism, of fascism, and they argue that it did not stop with the fall of the Nazis. That development, and the development towards total integration, they said, been interrupted but not terminated. It threatens to be consummated by means of dictators and wars. And so they see that they are prognostic about about the consequences of Enlightenment was kind of confirmed with the next decades after the Second World War. So there was enough material to make echoes with the thesis of the book, which is, the limits of Enlightenment or enlightened reason. But it is also a demonstration of critical theory. So you can say that there is an ethical dimension to this book. We have to reprint it because this book is what launched critical theory, and the goal of critical theory is freedom, right? So there are people fighting for their freedom, so we have to provide them with the tools to freedom. So we reprint the book. So even though Horkheimer and Adorno by this time kind of grew very pessimistic about the impact of critical theory, that in the face of progress and the process of history, critical theory couldn't do much, they still argue that we have to be critical nonetheless. Quote, critical thought, which does not call a halt before progress itself, requires us to take up the cause of the remnants of freedom, of tendencies towards real humanity, even though they seem powerless in the face of the great historical trend. So the importance of critical theory is to allow for heterogeneity, to allow for diversity of thought, and not everything or every mode of thinking must be aligned with positivism, which is the central philosophy of Enlightenment, and therefore to allow philosophy, well, to be philosophy. That's why this book is also controversial, because when you take as your target Enlightenment, it's like you've taken reason and even philosophy as your target, which isn't what the book is about. It's often understood in that way, but it's not what the book is arguing for. As they say, our concept of history does not believe itself elevated above history, but it does not merely chase after information in the positivist manner. As a critique of philosophy, it does not seek to abandon philosophy itself. So this is a very ambitious task, and it's only natural that you thank the people who helped you along the way. So they mentioned Pollock, to whom they dedicated the book, and also Adorno's wife Gretel, who played an enormous role in assisting them through. Assisting Horkheimer and Adorno throughout their journey in writing this work. And so they end the preface by saying that they did not change much in this edition. Like they kept the book mostly untouched, because they actually changed many things already in 1947, but it would have made sense if they changed some elements, given that they want their work to correspond to its temporal context. But as they say, we did not want to retouch what we had written, not even the obviously inadequate passages. To bring the text fully up to date with the current situation would have amounted to nothing less than writing a new book. So they said that they have produced works that are more relevant to the current affairs, so it wouldn't be necessary to rewrite the whole book to make it fit to its context, to the context of the 60s and 70s. But they just did some corrections on misgivings, and that's it. So again, the context is very important, even when they admitted that they didn't change much, that they didn't try to make the book really fit into the context, because the context changed so drastically that they felt that they had to rewrite a whole new book. But I mean, you kind of get the point. The context is very important, and you have to be very attentive to that. And they also insist on the importance of the context in the next preface, which is the Italian preface of 1966. They insist on the importance of the social conditions in which it was written and in what context it was to be applied. They specifically say that although the book is about fascism and the Nazis, the authors identified elements in democracies of the United States that resemble a lot fascist ideologies, like America, which again is the country in which they were living when they wrote this book. It exhibited cultural features that were pretty vulnerable to fascism. They fear that if we don't pay attention to our culture, and again, they were talking about the 30s and 40s America, it will turn into fascist Germany, especially if it is a culture that values progress, specifically progress on the model of enlightenment. Now, the Italian preface is quite short, it's just 2 paragraphs, but there was another preface that the authors did not publish, and you will find it in the afterword, and we actually quoted some of it, and it is cited in its entirety in the afterword. Still, in this preface, we have another reason why the book is actually called a fragment, and it's also another reason why we should be very careful when we read the Dialectic of Enlightenment. They write, "It is supposed to form the introduction to the theory of society and history we had sketched during the period of the National Socialist rule." So the Dialectic of Enlightenment is actually an introduction. Like this whole book is supposed to be an introduction to a theory which they never actually develop, and so this makes this book some sort of an unfinished work, or maybe an abandoned or aborted project. I mean, we already talked about this in the afterword, and why the authors never actually finished it. But the reason is given here, which is the same that was mentioned before. The context of the 60s, despite its similarities with the 30s and 40s, was very different, and so those differences were important enough to make it, impossible to draw a complete theory of history, since it would be, based on elements from the 30s and the 40s that have become kind of obsolete in the 60s, quote. However, to construct a systematic theory which would do justice to the present economic and political circumstances, in a task which, for objective and subjective reasons, we are unable to perform today. We are therefore happy that the fragment is appearing in a series devoted predominantly to philosophical questions. And so, indeed, the book does answer to a specific, philosophical questions, which is mentioned at the opening of the second paragraph. Our book demonstrates tendencies which turn cultural progress into its opposite. So, the main question that this book tries to answer is why, when we think that we are heading towards progress, we often end up with barbarism. Why does progress turns into its opposite? Yeah, so that's the main thesis of the book, and they were explicit about it ever since the first preface. They write, "What we had set out to do was nothing less than to explain why humanity, instead of entering a truly human state, is sinking into a new kind of barbarism." So now we arrive at the original preface, the one published in 44. Now, because the book was only published in a limited amount and wasn't published for mass circulation, because of the conditions in which the authors were working in, but once the Second World War ended, Adorno and Horkheimer wanted to publish it like a book should be published, without the fear of the Nazi regime, of censorship, and also giving the social and political changes that happened right after the end of the war, that now the authors have more liberty and means to work and publish, and also make their voices heard. They decided that some changes have to happen to the book. So it's like in 1944 they only published a draft, giving their limited conditions, but now they can publish the book like they intended for it to be published. Again, the reasons for the changes were covered in the afterword, but here when you read the preface, you will notice that there are many asterisks on many words, and so those are notes, actually, that when you go to the end of the book, you can find what they mean. The asterisks are the things that the authors changed between the 1944 and the 1947 edition. Given that we are not going to rewrite a whole preface, the editor Noerr simply put the 1947 preface, and whenever something changed, you will just find an asterisk, and you can go at the end of the book to see what they mean. So we're not going to go over all of the changes. Some can be trivial, but others are definitely significant. Like, for example, when you when you go back to the quote that I just mentioned, you will notice that there is an asterisk over a new kind of barbarism. That's in the 1947 version. In the 1947 version, they say that there is a new kind of barbarism, but in 1944 they said that there is a renewed barbarism. So the word new kind of, these words are significant because first it says that after the war, people didn't really understand that fascism and totalitarianism, that's not some sort of mistake or accident. It's a natural consequence of enlightenment. But the authors, they didn't see anyone who was really eager to question or challenge enlightenment, and so they're kind of warning that what happened in between the 30s and the 40s can happen again, and it's not necessarily going to be the fascism of the 30s and the 40s. If you think that totalitarianism can only be, Nazis, then you're probably going to mistake a lot of totalitarianism for democracies or some shit like that, just like right now they are doing in the Middle East with Israel. So when you say that there is a new kind of totalitarianism, is significant when you compare it with renewed barbarism, because renewed barbarism kind of means that it's going to be the same fascism that we saw in the 30s and the 40s, whereas a new kind means that it's not necessarily going to be the same. So we're not going to go over all of the changes. You can go check them for yourself, but just keep them in your mind and pay attention to them whenever you meet an asterisk. Some changes may be trivial, but others are definitely significant. So keep that in mind. Anyways, now the reason why this book was kinda left to be a fragment is because we can say that it's because of a failure of philosophy when it comes to deal with historical events. Like history moves too quick for philosophy to grasp it in its concepts or theories. Like by the time Adorno and Horkheimer sketched their new theory of history, it was already obsolete. History has changed to some other stage, and so this is perhaps best described within what they call contemporary consciousness, which they thought it can be up to the challenge. They wrote, the further we proceed with the task, the more we become aware of the mismatch between it and our own capabilities. We underestimated the difficulty of dealing with the subject because we still place too much trust in contemporary consciousness. So by contemporary consciousness, they meant the scientific standards of enlightenment or the operations of modern science. Like these standards oppose theory as they are more focused on practice, right? Like they are purely pragmatic, purely operative, and so the authors soon discover that it won't make sense to use the operative reason of science in order to criticize the operative reason of science. They need, theory, but as they noted, there is a decline in theoretical education, and that the decline in theoretical education and enlightenment reason, they go hand in hand. Enlightenment reason go hand in hand with the decline of theoretical education. Like having a theory of history and society is no longer possible, since every kind of knowledge is reduced to a series of operations. So what we said earlier about having an integral theory in which all disciplines come together, like sociology, psychology, and epistemology, that project was soon abandoned. What remained is this fragment called Dialectic of Enlightenment, which is a profound skepticism about the promises of science. Quote, in the present collapse of bourgeois civilization, not only the operations but the purpose of science have become dubious. So science, they argued, seems to become a tool used by fascists and tyrants, or anyone with totalitarian sympathies and tendencies, to promote propaganda and their own power. So science rapidly destroys itself. Enlightenment brings its own destruction. And this destruction is celebrated by the advocates of totalitarianism. It's celebrated in the form of, hegemony. Like these figures have constructed a well-ordered a well-ordered, vision of the world, which is divided into neat categories. It is compartmentalized in different classes, and each class is a discipline about humanity. Like you have psychology, for example, has its own experts, which in 1944 were called the attorneys. They used this term in 1944. There are people who naively execute the vision of totalitarian leaders. I think that both the terms attorney and experts work here. Like a totalitarian tyrant would have a certain vision of what humanity is, and they put experts who would produce the kind of evidence that would confirm that vision. So they can be attorneys in that way because they work for the image of the dictator's vision. And so whatever is produced by those experts is called the culture industry. And so the goal of the culture industry is to make thought incapable of contradicting the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist in German means the spirit of the time. Which is, the spirit of totalitarianisms, the spirits of totalitarians. It's what produces fashion, which produces massive scale of conformism. So no one dares to think in any different ways or adopt a kind of thinking that goes against that zeitgeist. So I recommend that you check the notes here and compare the 1944 passage with the 1947. There are some changes, like the word zeitgeist was added in 1947 among many things, but I mean you get the idea. So the point is that they say this quote: if public life has reached a state in which thought is being turned inescapably into a commodity and language into a celebration of the commodity, the attempt to trace the sources of this degradation must refuse obedience to the current linguistic and intellectual demands before it is rendered entirely futile by the consequence of those demands for world history. So this idea of we have to resist the current linguistic and intellectual demands means that even your language must resist the language of the culture industry. That the culture industry wants thought to be controlled, to be a conformist thought, a thought as a commodity, which is a Marxist term. A commodity refers to commodity fetishism, which means that the things that we buy, the commodities, they become a fetish because they hide from us the process of production that made those commodities. So for Marx, money transaction, for example, reduce the objects that we buy to simple commodities. It hides, for example, the conditions in which it was produced, the labor of the worker behind it, the kind of relationship between the worker and his boss, etc. All of those things are taken out of sight thanks to the monetary transaction. And so likewise, when thought becomes a commodity, it means that thought bears no trace of the power relationships within society. And in the case of thought, it's not money but language that commodifies it. As such, to avoid the commodification of thought, we have to avoid the language that commodifies thought. Just like Marx thought that in communism there would be no need for money because people would see and acknowledge, each other's labor. So Adorno and Horkheimer thought about language and thought in kind of the same way. So that would require critical theory, which is also being slowly forgotten. Like Enlightenment is becoming less and less critical of itself, and so that's why it becomes self-destructive. It becomes simply a tool when in its origins it claimed to be more than just a tool. Now the word commodity is often associated with Marxism, and Adorno and Horkheimer were Marxist, but as we said in the afterword, there was a lot of Marxist terminology that was removed from the 1944 version, and we explained why as well. We already explained this thing about language in the afterword, and so the point of Enlightenment was, among other things, to make human beings, to make them free, to take them out of dependence on authoritative figures. Those were the priests, the popes, which were, using people's fears in order to control them. And so science was supposed to liberate them from their fears so that they don't stay, vulnerable to the manipulation of, the kings and the priests. That was the goal of, les encyclopédistes. These were, 19th century French philosophers and scientists who started writing encyclopedias with the hope that now knowledge would be accessible to everyone. So you have D'Alembert, you have Diderot. These were the most famous who contributed to the encyclopedia, l'encyclopédie. They were like, provide knowledge for people and they will be free from fear and from control. And so as such, Enlightenment hates the use of thought for the service of an order. What kept it an enemy of the existing order was its critical element, its own self-reflective side. But once that dies out, Enlightenment loses its capacity to resist that order, and so it becomes a tool to the same order that it was criticizing. Like religion, it too became a tool for the service of a certain order, right? So that's what happened with the rise of positivism. Positivism is a philosophy that only cares about what is instrumental, what can be measured, what can be quantified, etc., etc. And it's the philosophy of this guy named Auguste Comte. So whenever you see Comte, well, know that we are talking about positivism. And as Adorno and Horkheimer note, it is not a coincidence that positivism became the preferred ally or friend to l'Action Française. L'Action Française was a far-right movement of the that spanned from 1898 to 1944, and this was in 1944, but it was removed from it. But the point is that science became a tool for right-wing politics and totalitarian dictators. It now fuels fear again, perhaps in more extreme ways than when the church used belief in God and belief in afterlife to suppress people. Those same dictators are repudiating purposefully the critical elements of theory, which means thought, which is what got science its place under the sun, as they say, as the imperialist slogan says, and are now prostituting it for their own benefits. I like this image of critical theory being a prostitute. I mean, this is what they say. It's only allowed to live as long as it fulfills the fantasies of dictators. It is completely powerless and cannot do anything to resist them. So how can thought do anything when its tools are used for the promotion of totalitarianism? So this is the big question. And they give this this is a quote from the text, from the preface. In reflecting on its own guilt, therefore, thought finds itself deprived not only of the affirmative reference to science and everyday phenomena, but also of the conceptual language of opposition. No terms are available which do not tend towards complicity with the prevailing intellectual trends, and what threadbare language cannot achieve on its own is precisely made good by the social machinery. So, whatever can oppose positivist reason must either submit to positivism or must be cast out. And the culture industry plans on spreading positivism into all spheres of public life and of private life, but especially in education itself, like literature, philosophy, sociology, psychology, etc. All of these disciplines must either acquire the positivist way of doing things, or at least its language, or they will just be thrown away. And so when you read a text, like we said, in the introduction, I think, you just do it mechanically. That way, even your critical thought becomes integrated within positivist processes. It becomes, inoffensive, and it cannot resist the system. And so you are critical only so far as your class requires you to be, in order to pass your tests, for example, to get a nice diploma and find a job, contribute to the same economic process that is killing creativity in the name of creativity. in the name of independence of thought, etc. And so the critical disciplines must themselves become superfluous. They must present no threat to the system or to the current trends or the current order. Quote, to render their function entirely superfluous appears, despite all of the benevolent reforms, to be the ambitions the ambition of the educational system. So Enlightenment reason, therefore, doesn't liberate people. It doesn't make them independent. It just made them vulnerable to new charlatans and to new superstition. These new ones use facts and logic in the same way that the church used religion for political power, for maintaining an order, and that's it. And like the church destroyed religion with dogmatism, so too the facts and logic fanatic will do with facts and logic. And if it happens that some people, manage to escape the hegemony of positivist thought, they'll be blocked, or they'll be blocked with censorship, with the actual fear of political and institutional physical force and repression, or with internal and mental censorship. And so this is the big aporia of their work. The main theme is the self-destructive nature of Enlightenment, and it is an aporia because aporia means a dead end in Greek, because, well, it seems that the seed of totalitarianism is within Enlightenment itself. It won't be a problem if Enlightenment would be worthless, but we cannot really throw Enlightenment away. So we know that it has the seed for totalitarianism, but on the other hand, we cannot throw Enlightenment. We cannot, say that, well, we don't need science, right? So this is often a misunderstanding that critics love to make when attacking this book. They think that Dialectic of Enlightenment is an attack on rationality and reason, whereas it is not. As they say, we have no doubt, and herein lies our petitio principi, that freedom in society is inseparable from Enlightenment thinking. We believe we have perceived with equal clarity, however, that the very concept of that thinking, no less than the concrete historical forms, the institutions of society with which it is intertwined, already contains the germ of the regression which is taking place everywhere today. So regression in 1947 replaced the term reversal. So regression may seem to imply that the process of progress itself is going backward and is now producing the opposite effects. And so the book was about warning that we have to do something quickly about Enlightenment before it is too late. Like, Enlightenment cannot divorce from its critical elements. Without it, Enlightenment will just serve political delusion and won't care about truth anymore. So it just cares about pragmatic interests, which when coupled with paranoia and fear leads to an uncontrolled totalitarianism, which will always commit a genocide. It will identify a ghost as its enemy and will seek to destroy it by all means, and so costing millions of lives in the process. So nationalism is seen as a product of that fear. So protecting the nation against those who science or reason deems unfit or irrational or inferior. Like, this is the big problem. And so hence the reversal/regression of Enlightenment has another meaning. It means that Enlightenment subverts itself and embraces mythology, whereas reason was supposed to fight mythology. Now reason itself creates its own myth. It has its own heroes and its own villains. So people start using science for their own irrational fears, like priests use faith to justify their fear of women or organize, witch hunts. That fear in totalitarianism is no less different than the fear Enlightenment sought to combat, the fear from truth. So whether nationalists, religious fanatics, or pagans, Enlightenment too becomes afraid of the truth. Becomes afraid of the truth that can set it free, and prefers dwelling into its familiar fear against, the Jews, the poor, the women, the gays, the trans the other. And so the issue with truth is that fear makes it seem as ahistoric, like truth doesn't have any history, it transcends history. Hence, truth itself expresses only itself, not its context, not its time or place. If it does, then truth would mean that it changes, right? Since it expresses a context and that context changes, then truth too has to change. And so the arrival of the other, which is a term that they don't use, but I think you can just apply it here because it will be helpful. The introduction of another entity that changes the context is seen as a perversion, a straying away from the truth. And so having something changes the status quo means that you have something new that the ahistorical truth didn't really account for. That means that either this new element must be assimilated to the status quo, to the truth, or it has to be destroyed. And so this is what Adorno and Horkheimer reject. Ideas, even enlightenment itself, is an expression of a certain context, and so it is only truth when it is temporal, right? So as they say, just as enlightenment expresses the real movement of bourgeois society as a whole from the perspective of the idea embodied in its personalities and institutions, truth refers not merely to rational consciousness, but equally to the form it takes in reality. So in the 1947 preface, they removed the indeterminate article A in front of rational consciousness. So truth becomes the form of rational consciousness, and that form well depends on its giving reality. So truth is just a way to apprehend a certain context. So taking truth as ahistorical means that we give up on truth altogether. So when truth becomes ahistorical, meaning that it takes facts as well as takes fact as facts, in the way people like Ben Shapiro, for example, says, like it's always true and it cannot change, it doesn't depend on their context or anything like that. Facts turn into a cliche. When you remove the context from a fact, the fact turns into a cliche or into a stereotype. And the purpose of a cliche is to shield us from social deviation, from social changes and social progress, from actual progress. So cliches are the guidelines for conformism. So art, literature, philosophy, progress itself have validity only insofar as they are integrated within those cliches. Like this is how Enlightenment thinks, this is how totalitarianism thinks. Like they have to conform to those. Anything that can deviate is seen as a threat. And to conform to cliches means that ideas must be easily apprehended, that they lose all forms of complexity. So what scientific operations have brought is a proliferation of the ready-made, of things that don't demand a lot of cognitive effort to be understood. So everything has to be easy to consume, pragmatic, quick, and fast. So reading complicating books must be done in the most efficient way possible. People be making videos today on how to read 100 books in a week or stuff like that. Like here are some tips to read a whole Tolstoy novel in just 2 days or stuff like that. And so this is what is meant by sticking to facts and logic. It's not like people who say those things, who say those catchphrases, think it means. People, when they say facts don't care about your feelings, they think that they mean you must have some sense of self-control, that you can suspend your judgment and can approach issues objectively, so that you can analyze the subject in its entirety, so that you don't miss out on its complexity. But in reality, those slogans about facts mean that you have to stick to simple ideas, to stick to what is already established, to what is already conventional, to what can be understood quickly. And so what seems complicated is instantly discarded as a delusion. Quote, by tabooing any thought which sets out negatively from the facts and from the prevailing modes of thought as obscure, convoluted, and preferably foreign, that concept holds mind captive in every deeper blindness. But then, if that's what sticking to the facts mean, you can easily see how facts are simply used to maintain the status quo, right? We can what we can apprehend easily is what we are already familiar with. This is why Adorno and Horkheimer are worried about the language that we use, because they see that their purpose is to familiarize us with the status quo, to the point where we cannot think from outside the status quo. Every new vision, every new theory will simply come off as irrational, incomplete, delusional, because it is not based on facts. So it pushes reformers to find solutions to the status quo within the standards of that same status quo. So you don't actually evade the status quo. Facts are like myth in that sense. What they offer is what Adorno and Horkheimer call false clarity. Now, a false clarity is a clarity that is obtained at the expense of concepts. You know, concepts are seen like abstractions that people in ivory towers play with. They are not concrete, and people who stick to facts are more concrete. You know, they are in the real. And so, but that's basically myth. They write, false clarity is only another name for myth. Myth was always obscure and luminous at once. It has always been distinguished by its familiarity and its exemption from the work of concepts. And so this duality within myth and false clarity is seen in the relationship between the natural and the social. Like society has been at battle with nature for so long, as long as we can remember, actually, each trying to subdue the other. Society wants to control nature as much as nature wants to control society. And so the myth of enlightenment is a compromise. With reason, society is capable of enslaving nature, but only by replacing it by something else to which people, will be enslaved. And that is social progress. Like nature imposes its own laws on people, and so society imposes its own laws on nature, and thereby society becomes nature and by imposing its own laws on people too. So the social order itself becomes natural. Like scientists try to rationalize the natural world in order to control it, societies too are seen as obeying fundamental laws that can be reduced to simple facts. Nature and society become accomplices. You know, they both seek the same goal, which is the disappearance of the individual through conformity. The natural world of society is the economy. You know, the economy promises freedom from nature. People, by contributing to the economy, they can have houses, they can have shopping malls, they can have the AC in the summer, they can have heat in the winter, they have, washing machines, screens to amuse themselves, etc. Like the economy promises a liberation from natural laws by increasing comfort and being, by being provided for, but all of this is done in exchange for obedience. So this comfort is presented by the culture industry as a guarantee of freedom and individuality, but we see that it's just serving even further the disappearance of individuality and freedom. The economy is just like nature, only its domination over nature, and humans have reached some heights that are unprecedented, because now it's not through brutish or harsh condition that it takes away the power of individuals and of the masses, but it is through consumerism, by allocating goods to them. And so thought then, its sophistication becomes valued in terms of consumerism, in terms of conformism, in terms of its superficiality and fragmentation. Quote, intellectual's true concern is a negation of reification. It must perish when it is solidified into a cultural asset and headed out for consumption purposes. The flood of precise information and brand new amusement make people smarter and more stupid at once. So intellect becomes just that. It becomes an amusement and nothing more. It can be sophisticated, of course. The system allows you to have insight, but it will never reach deeply. It only goes deeply if it is going to justify the current order. This becomes, the purpose of culture. And so here again, it's important to highlight another misunderstanding. The thesis about culture is often taken as a rejection of culture, which again, it isn't. Adorno and Horkheimer do say that other intellectuals criticized the value of culture, like Huxley, Karl Jaspers, or Ortega y Gasset, but this is not what the book is arguing. It doesn't question the value of culture, but rather what is being done in its name, what is being done in the name of culture. They see that culture becomes a tool to eternalize, let's say, to eternalize the past. It becomes conservatism. But in conservatism, this particular conservatism at least, they just preserve the past as it is and not what is wanted in that past. They say what is at stake is not conservation of the past, but the fulfillment of past hopes. Like in the case of Enlightenment, in its name, again, we again here compare with the 1944 version. In its name, we are just reproducing its thought process, but its hopes, the visions of enlightenment, freedom, equality, rationality, and all of those things are not being fulfilled, right? So as they say, today, however, the past is being continued as destruction of the past. If up to the 19th century, respectable education was a privilege paid for by the increased sufferings of the uneducated, in the 20th century, the hygienic factory is bought with the melting down of all cultural entities in the gigantic crucible. So we can understand the destruction of the past as a destruction of the hopes of the past, but also as a destruction of the goals of culture itself, which leads to deculturalization. Like people become less cultured, less human, less, less evolved. Let's say they de-evolve. They regress to a state of animals of basic instinct. And so enlightenment does destroy traditions, but it destroys the culture of it actually destroys the idea of culture itself. Like first, culture is supposed to give identity, and positivist reason takes it away. It simply conforms now. But also the idea of culture means also elevation, growth, fulfillment. And so the creation of a culture that leads to the destruction of culture is, for example, seen in these two images. In the 19th century, only a few could have culture as high education, and for those few to be cultivated, you had to keep a lot of people uneducated. And those uneducated people must pay for the privileges of the few. So enlightenment served the destruction of culture's goal to have everyone access to this high education. And this is compared with the 20th century, in which we have a clearer image of the destruction of culture in its identity giving sense, where how in factories no one can be different. All workers must be the same. No one has a cultural identity that sets them apart. And so here as well, you notice that there are two changes. In 1944, it was the exploitation, and it's now replaced by the suffering. It's to avoid the Marxist-loaded term of exploitation. The afterword. And also in 1944, what was diluting the cultural identities was the concept of nationalism, which in 1947, weirdly, it was removed. But anyways, so the deculturalization of the culture industry has one effect that is really unsettling. They say, under the given circumstances, the gifts of fortune themselves become an element of misfortune. So technology has brought about comfort, but only in terms of production. We produce, we overproduce, but the social subject, the individual who disappears from the equation, or maybe disappears by being reduced to an equation, the individual sees their own life getting worse from that overproduction. Like overproduction becomes the cause for economic crises and more inequalities that lead to an increase of fascism. So the subject becomes the subject of that overproduction, of the car, of the chewing gum, if you look at the 1944 version. What is being produced, the processes of overproduction that never seem to stop, to be constantly running, producing more and more for its own sake. This didn't just get rid of metaphysics. Enlightenment came also as a reaction to metaphysics, like philosophy in the Middle Ages was about theology, about essences, about modalities, things that from a practical point of view have no value. So metaphysics for positivists was just verbal masturbation of people, living in delusions and fantasies, of people who don't want to organize and exploit nature for their own benefits. And so metaphysics were seen as a waste of time and of resources. And so Enlightenment was about transforming the concrete, the natural world, for the benefits of the people. But what happened is that it replaced metaphysics with production itself. Now, it is the chain work, the work at the factory, that serves as the essence of the world. They say that the hygienic factory and everything pertaining to it, Volkswagen and the sports palace, are obtusely liquidating metaphysics, does not matter in itself, but that these things are themselves becoming metaphysics, an ideological curtain within the social whole behind which real doom is gathering. That does matter. That is the basic premise of our Fragments. So Volkswagen replaced chewing gum and curtain replaced the veil in 1944. The concrete that Enlightenment championed became its own abstraction, its own ideological curtain. So people worship cars, they want to have their Volkswagen, otherwise they would feel incomplete. So what the culture industry produces is what your essence becomes. It dictates who you ought to be, right? So you are not outside of myth, you are still in myth. And critical theory lies in that it seeks to lift the ideological curtain to see what we that we are still living in myth. And this is what the book is about, to lift the myth of enlightenment. So that's what each chapter is really about. It's about how we can lift the myth of enlightenment. The first chapter is about the critique of the concept of enlightenment itself. They will argue that enlightenment viewed social progress as inseparable from domination over nature, and because of that, enlightenment is no different than myth. This is the main thesis of the first chapter and also, of the whole book. As they say, myth is already enlightenment and enlightenment reverts to mythology. Then you have the next two chapters, the excursuses, where they develop this relationship between enlightenment and myth and how it relates to domination. So in the first one, which is an analysis of the myth of Odysseus, Adorno and Horkheimer will show how the ideas of enlightenment about domination of nature and the norms of bourgeois society were already present in the Odyssey. Then you have the second excursus, which is about Juliet. We see how domination relates to morality. And then you have the culture industry, the third chapter, the fourth chapter. Sorry, it's often the most famous chapter of the book. It's mostly concerned with the media and entertainment, like movies, songs, radios. Like these productions' goal is to make concrete the values and ideas of enlightenment. Now, there was supposed to be a second part of that chapter, but it was published as an appendix to the book in Adorno's complete works, so it's not included here. It's supposed to cover the positive aspect of mass culture, but I didn't find it in either English or French. So if you can read German, you will find it in the description. Then there is the chapter on anti-Semitism, which is about how enlightenment reverts to barbarism in actual reality. And so this chapter was, according to them, also wrote in collaboration with another guy, Leo Lowenthal, and it was based on some sort of empirical research from the institute, from the Frankfurt Institute, which was kept alive by Felix Weil. Remember, we talked about all of this in the introduction, and it has some sections that weren't in the 1944 version. So we will go through all of this when we get to the chapters. And lastly, you have notes and sketches. These are bunch of paragraphs and ideas that they didn't find where to put them in the book, and so they kept them in their own. They put them all together in one chapter called Notes and Sketches, as you know, possible ideas for future works or some extracts from previous essays. And in the 1944 edition, there is a whole passage that was removed, which mentions some essays that they thought to add, but they didn't. So one of them is the English lectures given by Horkheimer in the US, called Society and Reason, but they were then used as a basis for Horkheimer's other famous work, The Eclipse of Reason. And well, that's it for the prefaces. We've been through everything that was written. Next week we are going to start the first chapter, which is about the concept of enlightenment. As always, I hope that these videos are helpful for you when you go on your own, read through the book, and yeah, sure, don't forget to subscribe, to like, to put a comment if you have any question. Maybe, you know, some parts of my close reading was convoluted or weren't clear enough. So feel free to ask any questions in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next.